Good morning. Glad to see you all here smiling and fit. That's very good after long celebrations last night, which is part of the networking program, very well organized by the students. Dear students, dear young conservators, speakers, colleagues. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the second session of the 5th IIC-Student and Emerging Conservator Conference in Cologne. The topic of the conference is the Conservator's reflection, as you all know, and in this second session we will focus on the Conservator amidst institutions. I am not a conservator myself. I trained as a chemist, and starting from university chemistry departments, my path, a little bit like the moth towards the bright light, I guess, has brought me slowly and steadily towards closer to the conservation profession. I quickly learned during applied analytical research projects in cultural heritage to greatly treasure the input and the information given by conservators. Then I worked side by side with a conservation team in the Art, Technology and Conservation Department at the Swiss Institute for Art Research, and now I'm involved in the teaching of the future generation of conservators. Throughout this path, I have gained great respect for the profession, which requires an extensive set of skills and knowledge across many fields, from art history to conservation to material sciences, and not to speak, of course, of the manual dexterity required to the most delicate treatments. These skills are not only required to understand the cultural heritage items under their care, but also to be able to integrate multidisciplinary teams, including curators, physicists, chemists, architects, sometimes in museum context, museum security teams, and so on. The discussion on this topic was, of course, proposed by the local organizing committee of this conference, and I must add here that they had their own share of the experience in multidisciplinary, or in contact and communication across many fields in the organization of this conference, because they had to interact and exchange with the legal team, the financial team, the building management team, everyone during the project. So I think you've gained a fair share of experience doing that, and well done. And this will be very useful for their future careers. In the description of the intent for this second session, you will find the following list of topics and aims. So, and I quote, the second session aims to examine the conservator's position in an institutional level and how related professions perceive us. We would like to have an open discourse about the qualities demanded by institutions and private companies, and which competence are valuable in helping our impact and involvement in the higher roles within institutions. That is training in management, leadership, business skills, human resources. Most conservators, whether freelancers or employees, will work for and in cooperation with institutions as well as with staff who are not conservation professionals. Consequently, interdisciplinary communication and positioning oneself in these existing structures is crucial. The image and impact of a conservator may vary in different environments. There might also be different experiences in working in private practice and working as an employee of a museum or other institution. It is important to determine whether we want to see ourselves in the future, where we want to see ourselves in the future, and what we want to achieve with our careers. Based on this, we would like to discuss ways to promote our profession and its influence in general, and also to share experiences of how senior level positions have been achieved or can be achieved, and how to motivate students and emerging conservators in achieving their goals. The goal of this session is to raise awareness of the importance of positively positioning our profession within institutions. That's what we're here to discuss today. We are very privileged to have a fantastic panel, which we have locked in this room for 2.5 hours, and you will have the opportunity to pick their brains and get information from them. So take advantage of that. It won't happen very often in your lives. So for our first speaker or panel member is Iris Schäfer. She's head of the Department of Technology and Conservation at the Wallraf-Richards-Museum and Fondation Corbeau. Iris Schäfer has a diploma in conservation of paintings and polychrome wooden sculpture from the Cologne University of Applied Sciences. And after holding other conservation positions, Iris has become the head of the Department of the Technology and Conservation Department at the Wallraf-Richards Museum in 2002. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's right. She initiated and participated in numerous successful multidisciplinary projects, research projects, including the project entitled Painting Techniques of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, which was a joint project taking place between 2005 and 2008 with the Cologne Institute for Conservation Sciences, being rewarded and awarded in 2010 the IIC-CEC Award, which is a biennial award given to individuals or groups for contribution to the promotion of understanding and appreciation of the accomplishments of the conservation profession. From 2009 to 2013, she was also involved in the research project of the technology of late medieval Cologne paintings in collaboration with the Alte Pinakothek and the Dörner Institute in Munich. Iris Schaefer and her team, must also say, are greatly involved in many initiatives to bring art technology and conservation out of the atelier and into the museum space on many occasions, so bringing awareness to the profession. And we look forward to having her statement now.
Good morning to everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this important conference for inviting me to this session and for preparing this session. As already mentioned, my name is Iris Schaefer and I'm head of the Department of Art, Technology and Conservation at the Wallraf-Richartz-Museum and Fondation Corbu in Cologne. Some of you have had already the opportunity to visit our museum and our department yesterday. For the others, I would like to mention that the Wallraf-Richartz-Museum is the oldest municipal museum in Cologne and houses a collection of paintings, prints and drawings from the medieval period to the early 20th century. In 2001, Gérard Corbu and his Cologne-born wife, Marisol Corbu, made over the extensive collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings to the museum. As a loan in perpetuity, I have to mention. To thank and honor these two benefactors, the museum has ever since borne the name Wallraf-Richartz-Museum and Fondation Corbu. I would like to briefly introduce how many conservators work in our department and what tasks we perform. We have slightly more than 3 staff positions in our department, 2 at the part-time for the conservation of paintings and 1 for the conservation of works on paper. We regularly offer internships for beginners or students from different universities in Germany and abroad. Moreover, from the very beginning, we work closely with the CICS, which we greatly appreciate. It's great luck to have such a superb institution near us. Regarding our tasks in the museum, they include, as I think it's usual in museums like ours, they include preventive conservation at first, conservation and restoration treatments, but also technical examinations, and from time to time, as mentioned by Esther, collaborative research or conservation projects, including the application for funding. Furthermore, we provide conservation services for exhibitions and inward and outward loans. Although we are only a medium-sized museum or slightly more, the latter task requires, on average, a full staff position. In general, our work is appreciated by the entire museum team, including the management. Nevertheless, problems arise again and again, and we often think that this happens due to a lack of understanding of our profession and its complex tasks. For this reason, we have been trying for many years to inform and to involve as much as possible the colleagues, especially art historians or curators and the management. For example, if far-reaching decisions have to be made regarding conservation or restoration treatments, we always involve the curators in the decision-making process. We have benefited greatly from this exchange and this cooperation. But in general, I'm certainly not the first to make this demand. We need better and closer communication among conservators and curators. For this reason, I wish for an improved exchange in the training of conservators and art historians. At best, this should be done as early as possible in the training of both. In future, this could facilitate and encourage communication and cooperation for joint projects and joint publications. For example, the creation of exhibition catalogs, collection catalogs, or beyond that, catalogs raisonnés. Concerning the question how to promote our profession, I think in a museum we have the opportunity to share our knowledge not only within the institution, but also with the broad public. This can flow into the captions of the exhibited works, special presentations, whether small or large, in which we provide the public with insights into restoration measures, technological investigations and their findings or other things. Some of you might already know our permanent presentation called From the Museum's Laboratory, where we offer visitors a variety of insights into our work. We are certainly not the only ones who use ways like this, and Patricia Noble is here. She can talk about high-end public presentation, the conservation treatment of the night watch, for example. But I'm certainly convinced that these and many other forms of public presentation offer the chance for increasing perception and appreciation, beneficial for the impact of our profession and for further projects and their promotion. That's basically what I wanted to say at the beginning of this conference or session. Sorry.
And now thank you, Edith, for your contribution. And our next panelist is Sarah Stanford, the President Emeritus of the International Institute of Conservation of History and Artistic Works. Following 6 years of the president position until this year, 2013, he became President Emeritus. Sarah is a trustee of the English Heritage Science Museum Group, the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons, the Pilgrim Trust and the Landmark Trust, professor in practice at the Durham University and the member of the Westminster Abbey Fabric Commission. She's a fellow of IIC, the Society of Antiquaries, the Royal Society of Arts. Sarah has held a number of roles in the National Trust, starting as an advisor for conservation and climbing all the way up to management, senior management positions. She worked also at the Scientific Department at the National Gallery from 1980 to 85. She was educated initially at Oxford with a degree in chemistry and then received a diploma from easel paintings conservation at the Courtauld. Sarah Stanford has taken multiple roles within cultural heritage institutions, conservator, conservation scientist, senior management, and we really look forward to hearing of the skills required to work and thrive through multidisciplinary environments and roles and how to climb up to senior management position. Sarah.
Thank you, Esther. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much to the organisers for organising such a beautiful conference and for including me in it. It's always an absolute pleasure to be able to talk to students and emerging conservators at this stage of your careers. And I'm particularly excited about my new role at Durham University. And I think Durham have been very enlightened to create these professor in practice positions. I don't know if you have anything similar in Cologne, but each department throughout the university is able to appoint 3 or 4 professors in practice, and they are people who have jobs or occupations outside the university, but they're invited to come in and to talk to the students actually about what it's like being at the coalface. And that's very much what we're doing over these 2 days. So I thought the best thing was for me to say a little bit about my career development from when I was just like you, thinking about what I was going to do in the future and how I ended up where I am now. Although I probably will stop at my most senior position at the National Trust, if that's okay, rather than, I don't think we need to talk about the sort of post full-time working occupations, which I do at the moment, because that's so far ahead for all of you that you don't need to worry about that yet. Although, you know, when you're mid-career, I'd be happy to come back and say a little bit about that. But as Esther said, I started off reading chemistry at Oxford, so I'm a scientist. But I always knew that I wanted to work in the arts, and I don't know how many of you have heard of C.P. Snow, but he wrote a really influential book in England called The Two Cultures, which really sort of deplored the separation of art and science education. And I always loved painting. I was very interested in art history, but I was really good at science. So it was difficult to find a degree that would allow me to do both. So I decided to do chemistry. And while I was doing chemistry, I thought, well, what can I then do that combines art and science? And that was when I discovered about conservation and applied to the Courtauld Institute and was able to do the diploma in easel paintings. But my love was science. I did my research project at the Courtauld was scientific. I looked at colour measurement of paintings, and I started a PhD. And I did want to mention that PhD thing because I know that came up yesterday. And I suppose I was obviously very interested in my research topic, but also I didn't have a job at the end of my diploma. So there was that question about what was the next stage. So I started a PhD, and one of my biggest regrets is that I never finished that PhD. But I didn't finish it for a good reason, which was that a job in colour measurement of paintings came up at the National Gallery Scientific Department. So it was a sort of no-brainer to move there and work with Gary Thompson. And I'm afraid Gary's advice to me, which I don't think I would say to any of you if you were in my position now, because I think PhDs are more important than they were then. Gary said to me, "Oh, Sarah, now you're working at the National Gallery. You don't need a PhD." Well, it's unfinished business for me, and I am determined to finish my PhD. So, oh, excuse me. So that's just a little aside about PhDs. Working with Gary Thompson was fantastic. It gave me my interest in preventive conservation. But my next job, I was hired by the National Trust to advise on paintings conservation, which I did for a year. But then I realized I was wasting my time because the environment in the 300 historic houses that the National Trust opened to the public was very bad. And paintings were becoming moldy, they had condensation on them, all the usual problems associated with high relative humidity. So after a year, I said, I want to advise on environmental control as well. And I just wanted to say a little bit about how preventive conservation enables you to develop your soft skills, because I know that one of the things you particularly want to talk about in these 2 days is the soft skills. The technical skill development is a conservation training course is a perfect way of developing your technical skills. But you also need to pay attention to your soft skills. And those soft skills, and by soft skills, I mean things like your ability to communicate, to explain what you're doing, to persuade and negotiate, because in all my years at the National Trust, even when I was on the senior management team as Historic Properties Director, I could never tell anyone what to do, because all of the day-to-day running of the National Trust was in the hands of the operational management line. So those were the general managers of each of the National Trust properties. So everything that I did throughout my career was by persuading people to do the right thing as far as conservation is concerned. And actually that's a very, very powerful way of interacting with people And I think that many of you will find when you're working, you're in that position because you will be working alongside other professionals. And Iris was already saying that in her museum, that it's all about negotiating with other professionals. And you particularly have the opportunity to do that with preventive conservation, because as well as working with the art historians, the architectural historians, you are the curators, you're working with engineers, with architects, with quantity surveyors, and with the operational managers. And that multidisciplinary team working is a really, it's important to be good at it. And it's important also to understand how the organization works. So what levers do you need to pull to promote conservation? And that comes when you understand where the power is in the organization. So as soon as I understood that all of the power was with the general managers and the operational line, it was much easier to know who you needed to persuade to do the right thing. So I realised that I'm probably quite close to the end of my time. So there were just a couple more things that I wanted to say. Just as far as my career was concerned, I was 17 years advising on paintings conservation and environmental control. So that was a very long time. And actually I used that time to develop my external networks as well. So that was the first time, for example, I was on the council of IIC. I also helped ICON, the UK bit of IIC, develop the professional accreditation scheme that was mentioned yesterday. I also was on the council of the Museums Association, so I didn't limit myself to conservation activities. I looked at wider things I could do in the museum world. And all of those things were a very good thing to be able to say that I had in my portfolio when the opportunity came, first of all, for me to apply for the role of head conservator, which I did for a couple of years. And then I became Historic Properties Director. And as Historic Properties Director, that was the department that had the archaeologists, the building conservation staff, conservators, curators, and gardens and parks. So in all, we're getting on for 1,000 of us. I mean, the National Trust is a large organisation with a very large professional staff. So team working was absolutely essential in that. And the other pleasure for me about the National Trust, it was that it didn't just look after houses, as well as the houses surrounded by the gardens and their parklands and farmland and woodland and coast and countryside. I was working with all of those people who were working on the land and countryside and nature conservation. So sustainability was an absolutely fundamental part of our work. And we were always looking at ways of doing things in the greenest possible. And it was very stimulating working with people from the nature conservation side of things, as well as from the historic environment. So multidisciplinary team working, absolutely crucial. Equality among professionals. I mean, we did establish that in the National Trust. So among all those professions that I just mentioned, we were all, I don't want to bore on about pay scales and things, but we had similar pay scales. There was no, sort of hierarchy of the conservators reporting to the curators. They all reported to me, and it was irrelevant that I was a conservator. So the disciplines were first among equals, as we say. They were all equal, and I think that's important for people's profession's self-esteems. Difficult to achieve, particularly in museums, probably easier in a heritage organisation when there are more professions involved. And the final thing I wanted to say was about training, management and training, management and leadership training opportunities. We have started doing some leadership training in IIC. At the Edinburgh Congress next year, we will have a half-day leadership workshop funded by the Getty. There are in our different countries various leadership programs that you can go on. I did a 2-week leadership training course, museum leadership training course at the University of East Anglia. And I have to say it was absolutely invaluable, because having 2 weeks away from day-to-day work just to focus on the development, at least identifying soft skills, reflection, self-reflection, so important to know yourself and where you want to go. You don't all, I'm unusual in a way in aspiring for a senior management position, but I knew I wanted to do that. Many of my friends who I trained with at the Courtauld, one of them is still, she is a fantastic paintings conservator at the National Gallery. She and I went to the National Gallery at the same time, and she has worked herself through all those wonderful paintings at the National Gallery. That's what she wanted to do, and that's what pleases her. So know yourself, self-reflection. And with that, I shall finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and I would like to reinforce that aspect. We're not having this wonderful panel as role models. They are role models, of course, if that's your decision, but it's not the only way through. But I think we have, each one of these panels had experience in this internal communication with different expertise within institutions and between institutions. And these are the right people for us to ask the questions how to solve those problems and what kind of experience they have to share. It doesn't mean it's the only way that we don't all have to end up in management and senior management and high positions. Our next speaker is Johanna Phillips. She's the director of the Conservation Center in Düsseldorf since May this year. No. Since last year, November last year, sorry. February. It goes fast, I do apologize. Where she leads an interdisciplinary team of conservators who are charged with the care and research of the city's art and cultural heritage collections. Prior to her appointment in 2019, Johanna acted as a senior conservator of time-based media at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York, where she founded the Media Conservation Division in 2008. And I think that was the first media lab in museum institutions in the US. Prior to the Guggenheim, Phillips specialized in the conservation of contemporary art at the Swiss Institute for Art Research in Zurich, and as a researcher in the Swiss Media Conservation initiative Active Archive. Phillips holds an MA in Painting Conservation from the Dresden Academy of Fine Arts. Johanna Phillips was also the initiator of the computer-based art conservation initiative, together with the Department of Computer Science at NYU Koran Institute of Mathematical Sciences. So Johanna is clearly not afraid of exploring new conservation territories, having to persuade other disciplines to walk with her that path. We look forward to hear of her experience.
Thank you, Esther, for the great introduction, and thank you to the organizing committee for putting together this exciting conference. I was here yesterday as well, and I think it's a very, very timely topic that you chose to explore, the image and the self-image of the conservator. And one recurring topic that came up yesterday was the frustration about the low salaries that we find in institutional employment after years and years of academic training. Emerging conservators are rightfully upset. What does the low salary say about the recognition of our work, of our profession? Where does the conservator stand within the hierarchy of a museum? And how do we collaborate with other disciplines, other departments, if we are not regarded as equal players? So who gets the credit for our work? And I wanted to tell you a little bit as well about how my career path went and how I came to institutions. When I graduated from the Dresden Academy, the Dresden Conservation Program 17 years ago, I was not as aware of the job situation as you are today. I was pretty naive. I was sure that I wanted to pursue an institutional career, but I had to find out the hard way and pretty quickly that the only entrance into the museum world in Germany at the time was to become a so-called Volontär, which is the low-pay version of a graduate fellowship for 700 euro a month at the time. And I was really upset about that. I was part of the generation that still had to absolve a 2-year full-time pre-program internship before we studied 5 years. So I had done 5 years of training. That pre-program internship is always unpaid, of course. And there I go with my master degree, and I'm expected to do another round of a couple of years of low-pay work. And I simply wasn't up for that anymore. So I decided that I had to cast a wider net. And luckily, I found employment at the Swiss Institute for Art Research in Zurich, actually on the very position that Professor Ferreira mentioned yesterday. The experience of working at the institute really laid the foundations for my professional career, and it shaped my expectation towards work cultures wherever I go. For the first time, I experienced true interdisciplinarity between conservators, art historians, conservation scientists. I was able to participate in research projects, contribute to conferences. I specialized in contemporary art and media art, and I was able to publish. After 5 years in Zurich in 2008, I moved on to the Guggenheim Museum in New York, where I launched the first media conservation lab in the US Museum, and I led the time-based media division for 10 years until I came here 8 months ago to become the director of the Conservation Center in Düsseldorf. The Guggenheim, too, as a modern and contemporary art institution, places great importance on the interdisciplinary and cross-departmental teamwork. So you have to imagine that curators, conservators, exhibition designers, technicians, and registrars all work closely together to bring works into the collection or to prepare them for exhibitions and loans, etc. The different disciplines respect each other's areas of competence, and decisions are made together as a group. And those of you who are into contemporary art probably know the documentation model for time-based media that I developed, and that is being widely adapted, which is based on tracking that interdisciplinary decision-making, because it's not the artist on his or her own and not the curator on his or her own that determine what these works look like when they're installed. It's a group decision. So, in this kind of horizontal structure, which is also, a horizontal structure is also reflected in the salary. So depending on the degree of seniority, a conservator could well make more money than a curator. So all in all, and this of course is a generalization, everyone's perspective is subjective and I have to generalize, but I think I have come around enough to probably perceive some tendencies. Working in the US made me experience my profession as a very well-regarded, well-connected, and pretty well-compensated profession that is also well-organized in the AIC. I think the AIC is a fantastic organization. I was very active in that as well. So on more than one occasion did my colleagues from Germany tell me, "You are in paradise over there." And these were colleagues who work in media conservation at different German institutions and who are very frustrated. The steep hierarchies at their institutions prevent them from implementing workflows and decision-making protocols that depend on eye-level exchange across departments. So in these institutions with these steep hierarchies, the conservators often report to the curatorial departments And unfortunately, this is still a very common org chart in museums in Germany. And I'm only speaking to Germany because, this is my deepest insight. I assume it is similar in other European countries. So, in contrast, at the Guggenheim and many other US museums that have been able to spearhead media conservation or other innovative practices, the reporting structures are parallel. The head of conservation is equal to the head of curatorial. And this is the key issue at stake here. These legacy hierarchies where conservators are situated lower than curators do not only affect our day-to-day lives with low salaries and much frustration, they suppress professional practices and research areas that are based on interdisciplinarity. And one such field is technical art history, for example. Yesterday, Emma Hermans talked about this, and Germany is not a front runner in this area for that very reason, I think, in my opinion. The same is true for the conservation of media and performance art. Germany is way behind international developments. So many of the artworks I've been dealing with are information-based. This means the conservator doesn't wait until a damage occurs. The conservator is actually very active already in the stage of pre-acquisition and getting the work into the collection. The conservator needs access to the artist and has to sit at the table when the artwork's concepts are identified and preservation strategies are negotiated with the artist when purchase agreements are drafted. The conservator needs to have the authority to make decisions, or otherwise the museum can't collect these works sustainably. The conservator has to be able to stipulate digital components or reference materials that enter the collection. But what I hear from my colleagues in Germany is that they are not even consulted by their curator when a work is being acquired. They are informed after the fact, when the curator or museum director already accepted a hard drive from the artist with a ton of files in unchecked condition or quality. And that has huge implications for the museum's ability or inability to preserve these works for future generations, or, to be honest, for the next show in a couple years' time. So I think a huge challenge for all of you here, or the next generation of conservators, will be to fix those institutional org charts to fight for equality, for parallel reporting structures, for respect, for decision-making authority, for appropriate pay. And what can we do to rise? And I think the previous panelists yesterday already offered some very valuable advice, which I can only second, and I try to sum it up a little bit. Be vocal, be seen, be heard, share, publish and communicate what you do. Write blog posts, run a press release every time you're completing a fantastic project. Emma Hermans mentioned yesterday that the general public is highly interested in all things conservation, and I can only tell you that I share this experience. For example, at the Guggenheim, I used the blog segment on the Guggenheim website quite regularly to write about our activities, and it turned out that our blog post, "What is time-based media conservation?" is among the 5 most clicked pages ever on the Guggenheim website since its launch 20 years ago. So, just imagine that, what kind of audiences you can cultivate with that if you're lucky enough to work at an institution. And this, of course, takes your significance into the institution as well. Hone your public speaking skills, prime skills, very, very important. Forge alliances, not just within your institution, but with other institutions and other disciplines. One of my most important partnerships is with New York University, the computer science department there. Together we did amazing, or still doing amazing research on the front of the preservation of computer-based art, very new, uncharted territory. Yeah, and I find that being recognized by the outside world actually can also accelerate your internal recognition. For example, I organized a few major international conferences at the Guggenheim and elsewhere, and I invited my colleagues from the curatorial department to speak or to co-publish with me. And this fostered mutual appreciation of our areas of expertise, and we also, both sides, learned a lot from each other. Insist that your work is properly credited. How often does the curator, the art historian, publish the article and includes your art technological, publish an article about collection works or exhibitions, catalog work, etc., and includes the technological research that comes miraculously out of nowhere. So make sure that you are that you're mentioned as a co-author. Think who is the primary investigator, what is the order of names, be as stringent about these things as people in science are, for example. You know, it's not, we're not inventing the wheel here. Engage in art technology, science, and research. These topics generally help to build respect among colleagues, and they promote our profession. And unfortunately, we're still, and I find this especially in Europe, unfortunately, we're still often seen as manual laborers, as technicians, as craftspeople, people who execute the curatorial concepts that are made by others. And speaking of executing other instructions, please fix the info brochure of the Deutscher Museumsbund, the German Museum Association. It offers the job definition that, and I'm quoting, "The curator plans and controls the archiving and inventory programs and oversees the conservation and restoration of the collections, including their documentation," page 21. And then on page 27, the conservator develops, with the curator's agreement, all activities that serve the preservation and preventive conservation and restoration of the museum collections. Where applicable, the conservator executes the previously determined restoration work. So you see, this shows that the problem is systemic. It's not just the individual culture of a specific institution. So, in the end, and I'm coming to an end here, like most fights for equality, this is about power and decision-making authorities. Our field has a long way to go, but, and this makes me very hopeful, we have never been more connected, we have never been better networked, we have never been more visible than today, and I'm very optimistic that we can achieve this together. And one of the reasons I came back to Germany is because I want to be part of that change. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. I think we were going to have a wonderful discussion coming up. I'm already having a sense that finding the right ears within the institution and getting feedback externally as increasing the weight of your profession within the institution and the awareness really helps. But we'll have some questions, I'm sure the audience too, about details of how to do that and how you have achieved that. Our final panelist, last but not least, Vanessa Schmidt, is a master's student at the Cologne Institute for Conservation Science. She completed her bachelor in textiles and conservation of textiles and archaeological fibers, where she, for her bachelor thesis, examined the conservation and documentation of a Bolivian ponchito provided by the Weltkulturmuseum in Frankfurt am Main, a traditional textile conservation project. But within her master program, she already decided to go a little bit further afield. She is conducting a research on felt material using contemporary arts in collaboration with the Kunstmuseum in Bonn. She is in the 4th year of studies and has gained already work experience in internships and as a freelancer in institution and private studios. We look forward to hear of her experience as a freelance conservation bachelor graduate and the master students, how she manages to combine both activities and how student freelancers are perceived in the institutions employing them.
So thank you for the introduction. I worked in private and public studios, and the first work experience I gained were in form of internships, probably similar to most people here today. Afterwards, I had several freelance jobs, mostly in cooperation with other textile conservators. At the last freelance job I did, I was the only textile conservator. I had the impression that the ways I was perceived were different according to the situations. In internships in private studios and museums, I was mostly perceived as a trainee. I was offered insights in the conservator's tasks and was given smaller tasks that I could do on my own, but under the supervision of the conservator. I was introduced to common conservation and research techniques and learned basic methods of conservation. When I spent the internships in museums, the other employees perceived me as a trainee as well. They gave me insights in their everyday work and outlined practical or ethical issues. Other employees did mostly not confront me with subject-specific questions concerning textile conservation, but rather asked more personal questions. I did the task that the supervising conservator gave to me and worked bound by instructions. I participated in meetings and discussions where the other conservators were mostly interested in my knowledge of newer conservation researches and in general asked me what is taught at university. In the private studios, the focus was more on practical work experience. The other conservators were interested in new technical methods that I had already field tested, so their interest was more practical than theoretical. I would sum up that the longer I studied, the more other conservators and museum employees assumed that I could provide relevant subject-specific information. When I worked in freelance jobs together with other conservators, there was also a deep interest in practical conservation techniques, particularly in newer ones. When I worked freelance in a museum and I was the only textile conservator, I encountered many subject-specific demands. Indicated by the fact that I was hired to solve textile conservatory issues, the employees assumed that I had knowledge in all textile conservation concerns. Here, it helped me to distinguish between the questions and issues that I could definitely solve because of my prior knowledge and experience, and on the other hand, issues where I had to consult colleagues or literature because I was not definitely sure how to approach or solve them. I communicated my limits, which arose due to limited time or the limits of my personal skills, and referred to colleagues who could help instead. So concluding, I would say that it helped me to be confident about my knowledge and to be confident about my gaps in knowledge. One situation I remember quite good was that I found myself to be the lawyer of the object. Of course, many conservators share the opinion that it's our job to ensure that the object is treated, stored, and presented in the best possible way. But the bargaining position as lawyer can be unthankful if impressions emerge that you are personally not willing to comply with the counterpart's position. What helped here was to state clearly that the conditions under which the object should be treated, stored, and handled are based on scientific research and investigations, and that it's not my interest to complicate things, but in our all interest that the object stays in the same condition. I had the impression that if I communicate my position clearly, friendly, and based on scientific facts, interaction with colleagues in various areas is productive and characterized by mutual respect. I experienced that it was valued in many cases that I communicated my considerations openly, so that persons I worked with hand in hand could rely on my openness and my professional positioning. So qualities that were demanded of me were my theoretical and practical knowledge about conservation, as well as communication skills, including objectiveness and diplomacy. It was also helpful to show patience and not to take things personally. In conflict situations, I tried to take things easy and show an understanding of the other person's position without compromising my own. When I worked freelance, business skills were also necessary. This means First of all, a profound evaluation of the time you have, the time you need for the project, even for the different work steps, which resources are needed, which resources you can provide, and how much this is going to cost. If you communicate all these things before you start a job, and you communicate what you cannot know because of various factors, the persons that work hand in hand with you will feel informed, and in my experience will mostly perceive you as well prepared. It happened to me that I was confronted with tasks that I could not deal with on my own in museums or private studios. I solved the situation by communicating my needs, like missing materials or support that I need to fulfill the supervisor's or colleague's interest, and to ask for help. To ask for help is sometimes unpleasant, but it prevents stress, insecurity, and mostly creates trust. I got positive feedback for contributing my knowledge or experience in discussions or brainstorming sessions. However, I think it's necessary to previously check if your input is wanted and the timing is right. On the other hand, I learned that it's no mistake to communicate your interest in things you have no prior experience in. Communicating your interest is can be the first step to gain new work experience. What helped most to extend my knowledge and get internships as well as freelance jobs is networking. To introduce yourself to colleagues and to socialize. That requires your participation in work groups, organizations, congresses, as well as really getting involved in university. Social anxiety in various manifestations can prevent us from meeting and mingling with unknown persons. What helped me when I was nervous or unsure was to realize that there's at least one common interest between me and another conservator, and that's conservation. Most persons that I met were interested and open-minded and curious about meeting a new person that is interested in their field. What also helped was to state your interest in meeting new conservators, to those you know from internships or work experiences who can make an introduction or provide an initial contact for you. To network means also to present a summary of your current projects informatively and, if possible, in an interesting and entertaining manner. In my experience, colleagues are sooner or later interested in personal information, and for me it was important to be authentic but context sensitive. In a small field like specialized conversation, many colleagues know each other, mostly in person. The labor situation is intimate because of a very close co- or team working situation in the studios. Simultaneously, there's the urge to work under time pressure, but still precisely and meticulously, so stress can occur. Therefore, it's helpful that there's a compliant, trustful, and discreet atmosphere that you can contribute to. If you feel that you are not sure about what is appropriate to state in a work context, offers from university like Business Knigge can be helpful, or just speak to your fellow students. The context to your fellow students, training staff, or colleagues can be helpful to learn about interesting work projects, calls for proposals, or internships. What should be mentioned is that you are in charge and responsible for your work and life balance. So beside the voluntary and compulsory internship, full-time classes at university, and maybe the first freelance work experience, it is important that there's enough time to breathe and to relax and to love what your work brings to you.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think we'll be receiving 2 further microphones. And the discussion is open to the public. Do we have any urgent questions? We need a microphone back there. Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. We'll go to the front next. Yeah. Technical difficulties.
Hello. Oh, nice. Hi, I'm Virginia, coming from Maastricht, from Strad. And I had a question about this authority and the hierarchies. And I've had a couple of interviews where they've asked me some quite interesting questions. One of them is, if you find yourself in this position where you have to defend your ideas against people, like, or to just, how to say, kind of negotiate your points and maybe disagree with someone who's a higher rank than you, how would you go about doing that? And of course, you know, I can say, have confidence and stand your ground or something, but I was wondering how you as professionals would like to be approached by young emerging conservators who want to defend their positions, and how you go about kind of accepting challenges like that.
I think that critical discourse is super important, and it's only driving the quality of the work. So, you know, the more negotiation takes place, or the more people listen to each other's concerns, the better the final outcome will become. And I would hope to be that kind of boss that welcomes that enough. I can't speak for that. My team would be the better people to answer that. But I think it's highly important that every concern is listened to. And yeah, and I very much believe in consensus decisions as well. Of course, the final decision lies with me. No.
Yeah, there's just one question.
To answer.
Sorry, Patricia. Can you have the microphone?
Actually, should we give them a second?
Yeah, one is probably because only one was
three
speaking
here.
at the time.
No, I just wanted to respond to the same question, actually, because, and I think it was Vanessa, the last speaker, who actually mentioned that what's really important is to be polite, but to express exactly, you know, I think that's highly respected. I mean, in the Netherlands, I mean, it's a very democratic, all museums, institutions are very democratic. So whether you're an intern or whether you are a curator, you have a voice. And as long as you are polite in presenting your voice, you know, with all respect to who you're speaking to, I mean, you will be heard. And I think you have to be, you know, you have to speak up. Otherwise, no one's going to be able to understand what you're thinking. So you have to take that step. It's very important.
Yeah,
and I think when you're young, actually, there's a great appreciation for that. And people appreciate young people, you know, coming forward with an idea, or if they don't understand something, then just say, well, I'm not quite sure if I follow the argument. Could you explain it? You have to do that.
But that's, I wanted to pick up on that as well, because you cannot expect, I guess, the other members of that team, of the other participants in that discussion, to be fully aware of the needs of an object, of an item in terms of conservation. So you actually also have to communicate the conservation needs in a professional and clear manner. So that's also a challenge for a younger conservator, let's say. So not only be self-confident, but also be able to provide the information so it's clearly understood what the needs are. Not expect that knowledge to be there, perhaps, also. I don't know what's the experience. Yeah. And I think, Iris, you probably have quite nasty experience in that communication internally as well, because you have persuaded, or you have brought a lot of awareness to the needs of conservation internally, and how do you know who to talk to and who will be the important listening partners, and how do you put that point across?
Yes, it's really, as I mentioned, it's really important that we talk about our work, that we search for cooperation with the curators or others, I think the registrar or even the the administration, everything should know what we do. It's no secret service. But we are open-minded, and we have to talk and search for cooperation with all members and even curators. I think our work is appreciated very much in the museum, but when I started my career, it was, as Johanna mentioned, more difficult, because curators were these ones who asked for conservation and couldn't understand why there's no possibility, or why it's difficult, or why it takes too much time in regard to the time they wish that this foreign exhibition done. So that's my experience, and now it's better, but it was a long time, together with Caroline, to persuade our curators and the management that our work is very important and that we have to be heard.
I just want to pick up on the notion of persuasion, because this word occurs a lot today. And I think one other really, really important skill to hone for being a successful persuader is empathy. You kind of have to understand where the other side is coming from. And Esther just mentioned, you can't expect the curator or or a decision maker or the manager, the HR person also, to really understand what your argumentation is, what your perspective is also. So you kind of have to shift your strategy every time you talk to a different person. You kind of have to imagine, okay, where is this person coming from? What does she or he know? And how do I speak to that person? So sometimes you have to, or actually in most cases, you really have to simplify things. You have to go for broad strokes and big picture and kind of pick them up where they are, and then lead them to the place that you would like them to speak to as a partner.
And one more tip when you are working with a more senior person who likes to feel they're the boss is to make them feel that something is their idea.
Oh yeah.
I have found this enormously effective.
Great skills for creating internal awareness of conservation and for life. Yeah, that's good.
Definitely for life as well.
Absolutely.
So here, how do you deal with it when conservation is not a priority in your museum? Because, for example, one of the first jobs I had this experience, like the operations manager for the museum came and said to me, like, conservators always make it so difficult, you're making up things, like, where do you come up with these ideas? And I was just new, I knew it was something like from before, and I know this happens in a lot of museums because it's not a priority.
I'll start answering that, because particularly working with preventive conservation, often the treatment of an object wasn't the priority. So I'll answer the first half of that question, which is the one about establishing priorities. So you have to be aware of what the overall priorities might be in a museum, or in my case, a historic building. And very often, the priority for us was to repair the roof, because without, this is obvious, but without a roof that doesn't leak, there is absolutely no point on working on the collection. So the first answer to your question is to be sure that what you are advocating for is an overall priority, and that's when it, understanding where your colleagues are coming from comes into account. But then there's the other thing, when you are sure that what you're advocating is a priority. Perhaps one of my colleagues would like to take on from there.
Well, it sounds to me that the situation that you're describing in your museum is a whole history of missed opportunities to talk to each other. Apparently, I mean, that's a prejudice against a certain group of staff, right? That their work isn't as important as other people's work, or not as justified as other people's work or so. And apparently successful communication hasn't happened on why these activities are important. And I think it's not only up to the conservation department itself to justify what they do, but the higher management should make sure that everyone in the organization stands behind the mission statement. And if the mission statement of the institution says, we preserve our collections, we study our collections, we exhibit our collections for generations to come, then it means that every part of that organization plays their role in making and realizing that mission statement. So I see a failure also on the side of the management that it allows this miscommunication to happen within the staff. I don't know your museum. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just treating as a example.
Hi, I'm asking from the social media table here. There are actually two questions going in the same direction, and I hope I can sum them up somehow. And both of the questions are going in the direction of whether conservators often make the experience that the different conservation specialities or departments like textile, paintings, or modern material conservation are perceived differently in value, or if there is one that is mostly the most important one, do the others feel neglected or something like that?
Is that both of the?
Yeah, that's the
Okay,
common essence.
When I was in the head conservator role, was confronted with prioritization among the different types of objects that we had in National Trust houses. And we developed a prioritization method for looking at the significance of objects, their conservation need, what they offered in the way of visitor experience, and we had a whole lot of weighted criteria which we used to make that prioritization. So it was quite a sort of analytical way of doing this. But we obviously were aware of this prejudice against some forms of conservation, which is why we developed a proper prioritization method. And I think that both of those questioners are absolutely right, because ironically, paintings conservation, and at the National Trust, we always work with freelance conservators, apart from textile conservation, which we did in-house. But paintings conservation is one of the cheaper forms of conservation in the freelance world, yet the paintings have a much higher financial value. So overall, you could say that the conservation of easel paintings is the first among equals of the conservation fields. And I found myself constantly having to defend and particularly lobby for textile conservation, because the National Trust had something like getting on for 1,000 tapestries. And you can imagine, you know, the sort of condition that tapestries are in historic houses with poor environmental control and high light levels. And 3/4 of the financial backlog of conservation work in the National Trust was for tapestry conservation, and our in-house studio couldn't cope with that. So I think that one has to recognise that there is a hierarchy among the different fields of conservation, but as a manager of conservation, you have to find ways to overcome that, and the way that we did that in the National Trust was through a prioritisation process using weighted criteria, which we have written up for an IIC paper, actually, I think for the London conference, which I could find the reference to if anyone's interested.
Yeah, I have a little bit to say to that as well, because my specialty is media conservation, and 80% of the lobbying work that we do to even enable activities within media conservation is to convince people that these works deserve the same kind of conservator attention and treatment and preservation strategy as other works that may be more valued. And you just touched on the monetary value of works. Of course, the insurance value of a painting is, I don't know, 2 million. And a video artwork is often very, very contemporary and was created 2 years ago, and the museum paid the artist $12,000 to pay it. So, the appreciation of these works is also tinted by the monetary value. So, of course, we in conservation should remind ourselves of our codes of ethics that demand that, similarly to the medical field, we shouldn't distinguish between the value or how much we like, a person that we conduct heart surgery on. Was it a good person or a bad person? We should do our job well, and I think the same applies to all kinds of different artwork species. But that too, the democracy between across the disciplines is certainly a topic that's another fight for equality that people, have to fight. I'm sure you have something to say about that too.
Yes, in our museum we have only 2 specializations. It's the conservation of works on paper and the conservation of panel or easel paintings, and that's quite equal, I think. There's no difference, but we are only a small team, and I can imagine that this is not the case in general. And we have to think about museums as well, smaller museums where no conservator is available. So I don't know about the situation in this case.
Maybe say something about the Rijksmuseum. We have 6 conservation laboratories, and they're all considered equal. The big difference, of course. No one? So we have 6 in the Rijksmuseum. We have 6 conservation laboratories. The big difference between the laboratories. Still not on.
You want to use this one here?
No, it works. I think it works now.
Okay, now it's working. So in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, we have 6 conservation laboratories. That is paintings, furniture, paper and photographs, textiles, glass and ceramics, and metal conservation. The big difference between the 6 laboratories are the number of conservators working in the laboratories. We probably have almost 20 people in paintings conservation. While in textile, there are 2 or 3, and in glass and ceramics, 1 or 2. So, there's a huge difference in the size of the labs, but there is no real priority in terms of funding or a lot, of course, depending on the sort of, the 5-year plan of the museum, it can be in a period, and we're in such a period now where more attention or more visibility is given to paintings. But that is really, depending on the sort of the vision of the museum or, the planning in place. So.
And Patria, does that reflect the collection, the number of conservation and the staff and the size of the ateliers? Is that reflective of the collection needs, I guess, and volumes?
Well, not really. I mean, we have some 7,000 paintings in the collection, but there are many more metal objects, for instance, in the collection, many more photographs and paper. I know I do hear complaints from our colleagues in paper conservation that they're much more exhibition-driven compared to, the demands put on paintings conservation. So essentially, they complain that they have very little time available for research, where research is at least 25% of what we do. So there is a difference in that sense. But again, that is also partly to do with your collaboration with your curators and your year plannings, what kind of plans you have in place, with your curatorial colleagues.
Hello. No, that's okay. My name's Genevieve. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Melbourne, and I currently work in frames conservation at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I just want to speak to this idea of power and decision-making in the institutional level, and particularly whether this is perhaps more reflected in public institutions as opposed to private institutions, but also it's a bit of maybe a difficult thing to have a direct answer to, but what has allowed this kind of paradigm to become so, I guess, systemic, and is it because our identity as a profession in conservation is still, we're still trying to advocate for that, we're still perhaps not quite visible in the, as you say, the hierarchy of kind of functions and job descriptions in a gallery institution, or because I know outreach and self-advocacy and things like that are becoming really hot topics in conservation profession and more apparent now. Just wondering if anyone here has any experience, can speak to, we spoke before about this idea of leveraging what the bottom line of the gallery stands for. Mission statement, thank you. And kind of bringing it back to that. But then what kinds of, I guess, sort of tangible things can we actually do, especially as small players coming into this field, like emerging conservators, to be able to, be part of this discussion and actually start this, change happening, basically.
I think these were two questions, and we already perhaps in part answered the second part. What can we do? I think stay confident and make sure that you are heard and seen, and it's not an easy fight. But I think you addressed a really, really interesting situation there with the public versus the private institutions, and of course I am thinking about that a lot now as well, because the museums are in the public sector in Europe. The taxpayer funds culture in most parts, and this is not the case in the US. Most museums are independent foundations that are in charge of their own fundraising, etc. And I think again, I have to be very careful, because each institution has its own culture, and there's I can only generalize if I open my mouth now. But what I have observed is that it is much, much harder for museums in the public sector
to change job descriptions, to upgrade salaries, because there's always either a communal or a state or a federal administration that is involved in that. And in Germany, if you work in the public sector, there are salary groups. I'm sure that's the same in the UK also, where you are simply, your job is placed in a specific group, basically. And it's very, very hard to get out of those groups. And those groups are awfully low in Germany for conservators, which is in part due to the fact that the last time that the Tarifvereinbarung, Jesus Christ, basically were updated up until a couple years ago, when the German Association for Conservators actually tried to change that, was in the 1960s. So the job descriptions that these salary groups are based on still describe the activities that Conservator did in the 1960s. And because contemporary art conservators don't do that much retouching with pigments or so, in some places in German museums, they have lower salaries than paintings conservators, because they don't fill all the checklists. They don't do the same activities that are checklisted. So there's a lot of bureaucratic work and lobbying that needs to be done to actually improve those salaries in public sectors. And why am I talking about salaries again when your question was about power and hierarchy?
It's all connected.
It is all very connected, and I can tell you that it has an enormous impact on your self-value and how others in the institution see you and your place within the hierarchy. If you have a group 9 or a group 10 when the curator has a 13. And that alone is self-explanatory. You don't have to try to fight for equal decision-making authorities if your salary says, no, you're a janitor. So I think that's why American museums or museums that are privately funded or foundations can more easily make adjustments, create positions much quicker, or to do what the Rijksmuseum did. I don't know if the Rijksmuseum is publicly funded as well, but to adjust the salaries of the conservators.
It took place about a year ago.
Yeah. Emma Hermans talked about that yesterday. Yeah.
I mean, just to take that a bit further, which is when you're confronted with a situation where there are these sort of unequal grades that the professions find themselves in, what do you do about that? And the National Trust is an independent charity, so was not encumbered by government red tape. And we had a major reorganisation in 2002, which created equality among all of those disciplines I mentioned before. And the process, one of the sort of the soft skills that it's very important to be involved with is change management. And how do you bring that process of change about? I mean, luckily within the National Trust, they wanted to do a reorganisation to make the organisation more efficient. And they decided to do that by involving people at all levels of the organisation. And I think that was quite enlightened, because that gave me my opportunity to sort of shine in an area other than conservation. And, I was lucky to be invited, but people were asked at all levels of the organisation, all different disciplines. And I think, I would encourage, whenever you're offered an opportunity like that, even though it takes you away from your day job, to get involved with those sort of, you know, wider organisational issues, and, you know, to promote them among your peers. Because another thing that happened, because not everyone, the curators among them, was happy about the reorganisation, and those people who were involved with the planning became the leaders of change. And it doesn't matter whether you're a senior or a junior person, you can still be a change leader. So you
Such an important statement.
so just take any opportunities and talk to, if you've got good bosses, you know, talk to them, because I was listened to as a junior member of staff, and that made me, when I became more senior, want to do the same, because I'd appreciated being listened to. And so listening, you mentioned listening, Johanna, that listening is so important, and feeling that you're being listened to is also very important. And treat others as you would like to be treated yourself, whether you're senior or junior.
Hi, I'm Lisa from the University of Melbourne in Australia as well. I was wondering if the panel envisage more positions being created in institutions in the coming years. When I was an intern at an overseas museum, the amount of work that was being collected, but at the same time the pressure on the conservation staff with exhibitions and loans meant just the regular billion-dollar collection doesn't get a lot of attention. And it seems to me to be quite a large problem that a lot of money is being spent on collecting work and storing work, but not much money is being spent on conservator positions to look after this work. And I was just wondering if that's actually a real concern or just my concern.
Do you want to speak? Yes, it's a real concern, even as I know, and for example, in museums, you have the history of loans. They arise since many years, and I don't know any museum which has get more conservators for that. So the stuff is always the same: more work, but no more conservators. So you have to fight for that. And I think what's really important in a museum, I know museums where conservators are along with curators, so separate conservators along with the curator, no conservation, no head of conservation. That's quite important, that you have one who is fighting for the department and for conservators. So it's a long way, but it's, I think what you describe is in many museums the case, even in museums with collections of modern or contemporary art, where the level of exhibition is very high. Yes, I think it's quite difficult. But I have no idea how to better the situation. But you have, what I would like to say as well, is we have the associations of conservators. For example, the German association, the VDR, he tries he criticizes, was heißt Stellenausschreibung? Bezahlung, the salaries. If salaries are too low or based too low, they criticize the institution. That's very important. I do not know if other associations abroad do the same, but we need the support of, for example, associations like IIC, ICOM, and we have their codes or their declarations which we can show to the management, for example, in a museum. We have to fight for it.
I can't really speak to your question because I'm new in Europe as well. I've spent my entire career outside of Germany, and I'm not familiar enough with the museum scene here. All I know is that, especially in the public sector, it takes years and years and years of fighting to create a new position, and I know that because colleagues have tried to implement media conservation positions, and it took 10 years or so to do that. Yeah.
I think what's also interesting is the way in which the profile of conservation departments has changed. And certainly during my career, I am seeing museums and heritage organisations, as far as their own staff are concerned, moving more towards preventive conservation and conservation management, in the sense of commissioning conservation from freelance people. So a tendency to use freelance people more than staff in departments. And certainly for the National Trust, there was such a logic in that because of the diversity of the collection and the geographical spread of the properties. For a single museum, that's sort of less justified. I think the second thing that you mentioned was the storage issue and spending a lot of money on storage. And I think there is a massive issue around sustainability of collecting. And Nick Merriman, who's now the director of the Museum of London, was director of the Manchester University Museum, did some very interesting work on just quantifying museums collecting patterns. And it was something astonishing. Like for every one object disposed, there were 1,000 acquisitions. And that is clearly unsustainable. And so there is a whole piece of work that is not conservation, but is really related to conservation around collecting patterns, because there won't be any money for conservation if museums carry on collecting at the rate they are. So, you're absolutely right to raise that.
In Australia at the moment, curators at major museums are talking about other models that museums can take to support artists. That doesn't involve collecting because they're having storage issues, and that we don't work on the sort of 18th century model of collecting everything we can find now. So that's a big debate that we're having in November as well, talking about different roles for museums, still, educating the public, still supporting all the people making new work, but do we actually have to keep the work as well? So it'll be interesting debate. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ruth from Portugal. I hope I'm not repeating the theme, but I have a real specific interest in the relationship between the conservator and the curator, because I'm also writing about it in my master thesis. So this is something we all know about, but it's like an unspoken problem, right? Like a latent problem that it's not written anywhere. My question is, why do you think it happens? Is it because of our history, the tacit knowledge versus the explicit knowledge of that it's more present, maybe the tacit one in the conservator? And how do you think it would change? Maybe with the salaries that you were speaking about. Do you think that maybe changing the salaries, like in the Rijksmuseum, like it was said yesterday, it would be a first step towards the equality of both professions? Or do you think it could be achieved without that change? Or do you think maybe some other solutions along with it? So I would hope that you would speak a little bit more about it. Thank you.
how to better the situation or the same salary, I think I have no idea. But as I mentioned, I think one problem can be that we do not know enough from each other. The curators, I can only talk or generalize because I know the situation in Germany. Curators do not know much about conservation. That's the first problem, and sometimes they are not trained in any, at least in Germany. So I know that many conservators already, or not many, a lot of conservators are now involved in teaching at the institutes of art history in Germany, but this is only a small drop. I wish for a better education from the beginning onwards, joint projects, summer schools together, conservators together with art historians. That would better the situation. But now, from this point on, I could wish for the same, for the situation which is now ongoing in the Rijksmuseum, but you can't reach it at once. I think it will be a long way. But I think a better exchange, a better acceptance, a better cooperation can only happen if we come closer in the education and the training of both.
I can only second what you just said. It's so important that we don't just look at the two professions when they meet each other in the institutions, but look at it as a system. And I was lucky to work in New York, where at the New York University you study conservation. You also do the degree in art history, and the conservation students and the art historians, art history students, they have classes together. So every time I went to lecture there, I had mixed classes, or you know, even more art historians and a few conservators that would have to learn about what we do in the museum. And that creates a mutual appreciation already in the academies. And I think that even this program here could do a lot to foster that exchange. I don't know if you have an art history faculty here, but you know, set up projects, and maybe you're doing that already, where students from art history have to work together with students of conservation on technical art history projects, on, you know, writing something together, presenting something together. And I think that's you know, that will be a huge investment in the future, because these people will meet again in the positions and the institutions. And maybe there was one Cologne question. Say something.
I have been working for 16 years as a conservator in this institution in Düsseldorf in the Conservation Center, and I always felt myself responsible for the artworks, in particular when it came to loan decisions, whether they should travel or not, and to defend that work which is in danger should not travel. And we had really long discussions about these loans, and what was really enlightening for me was that 2 years ago I had the opportunity to curate an exhibition for the first time myself. We had a 2 years preparation phase, and I developed a concept for that exhibition, and I started to write letters for support, and I got these responses from other museums and conservators who expressed their concern to lend these works. And then that changed a lot in my personal view of curators' positions and work at the museum, and also on my own role as a conservator. After that experience, to bring together 200 paintings in that exhibition, I felt we should talk much more about these pressures that also curators have to be successful in the museum institutions, and that conservation is part of all that. We train often, or are trained as conservators, to to protect the work and not to allow to do anything. And it's to understand each other is quite crucial. And I think if we try to communicate what we aim at and what are our goals and with the curators what their goals are, there is a much bigger chance that we can join these efforts and be much more successful and better recognized. I experienced that personally, that some graduates came to an institution and they said, no, this cannot travel, this is impossible, no, I cannot agree to this, and after a while they were not asked any longer by the curatorial department. So we have to talk to each other. What I would like to bring it to is that the training of conservators has changed quite a lot within the past decades. When I started my training, for example, artistic skills or artistic sensibility was much higher regarded. So we were trained in painting, drawing and all this, and sciences played a subordinate role. That changed then significantly. Science even dominated for a while conservation training. Now we have a wide range of issues to consider. It's not just technical and your manual skills, capacity to apply methodologies from humanities and sciences. Many soft skills were mentioned by all of you, like business skills yesterday, communication skills, management skills, negotiation skills. There are many new areas that were added. I remember well your talk in 1993 about preventive conservation. That was a whole new world that I learned about because it was not part of my training at the time. So then technical art history, contemporary art, decision making, and we realized that it's a constant shift. So in contemporary art we have now the need to include more methodology from humanities again, not just from sciences. My question to the panel would be, because you represent institutions and you have this long-standing experience in these institutions, where would you set personally priorities in that complex world? When we talk about here how or which qualities should young conservators bring into or should have when they enter institutions. I think that's a really crucial question when our field is constantly growing, where to set priorities.
I wouldn't set a single priority. I would always prefer a candidate who can convince me that they do an excellent practical job, but also be able to talk about it, to publish, to stand their ground and our ground as a conservator, and I find both really, really important and complementary to each other. I expect that a recent graduate, knows how to do scientific research and knows how to write scientific articles, knows how to present to the outside world the work that they're doing in my department or in my institute.
Sorry, you would first? I completely agree to Johanna. That's the same to me, and I think we have in a museum, or I can only talk from this view. We have it's the most important thing is preventive conservation. All these things you mentioned, we have to take care of our collection. And that's the most important thing. That's not the only one, but it's the first we have to do. And then we can try, I think we can, as I would think, the most important thing in an institution is to communicate and to ask and to speak with curators, for example, to be involved as much as possible in the museum's work, not to be close in the Department of Conservation. But certainly all these things you mentioned, for example, technical art history, but also technical investigations of the objects, and beside from conservation, that's a certain special interest in my opinion, for me personally. But this, I think, every candidate or graduate who is well trained, I think, is welcome. And I have no priority, but the first priority is preventive conservation. We have to take care of our collections.
I mean, Gunnar, I think it's really good that you asked this question, because I think it's an almost impossible task for the universities to create a syllabus that creates a conservator who is work ready. It is impossible. But I really like it that you asked the question. As I've already said, I like what we've got. 2 Durham University students here. I like it that Durham University have recognised across all departments the need for making more contact between universities and the workplace. And I think that if that communication and recognition is open, then there is more chance of conservators and indeed all other graduates at least having their consciousness raised. I mean, the words that we've said repeatedly today and day, over and over today, like, you know, persuasion, negotiation, communication, multidisciplinary working, you will remember those words, and when you get into the workplace, you will reflect on them, and you can't. I'm learning every day. I'm learning from being here. I'm always learning, and I think the most important thing that the Courtauld taught me actually was to teach myself and to learn from other people, because our whole lives are continuing professional development and continuing personal development, and that the best that the conservation courses can do are to teach the technical and practical conservation skills and to raise awareness of the other skills that are needed.
I've got one. Okay, that's right. Hi, my name is Deborah, and I'm studying here in Cologne. And I have 2 questions. First question is, when the VDR is working to get the wage higher and criticizes institutes who announce jobs which are really low paid, what reactions do they get? And the second question is, so would you apply for jobs which are low paid because it's better than have nothing instead? And do people, I don't want to criticize people who do that because I can understand, but how, in which way do people who apply for jobs like this bombard or crisscross the work of the VDR in this in their way?
I do not know very much about the reaction of the VDR or of the institutions when they get the reaction of the VDR, of the German Association of the Conservators. I can't help you in this case, but maybe Johanna.
Yeah, but you can complete your answer first, and then I can say something. Yeah. So we actually just had a very interesting exchange. We wanted to use the VDR's website job posting segment to announce a voluntariat, a fellowship in photography conservation, and the VDR refused to post it because the salary was too low. And as a result of that, we weren't able to fill the position properly. We didn't, you know, it was, yeah. However, it triggered a really interesting mechanism in the city administration, who is responsible for our salaries. And they actually took to heart the recommendation of the VDR and the Deutscher Museumsbund, who stipulate that, you know, stipulated recently that fellowships, voluntariate in the cultural sector should be 50% of a group 13 or so. And that was a few €100 higher than what we were offering for years until that point. And they're making adjustments now to those salaries as a result of the VDR simply refusing to post it. And you know, that's remarkable, I find. And also we all of our staff at the Conservation Center has been able to move up also due to the VDR's work on updating the 1960s salary papers that I was talking about. To, you know, the VDR did all this work to a couple of years ago to update the checklists, what actual conservators are working on. And our city administration took that paper as a basis to justify that the salary groups have to go higher. And that's why I'm saying being engaged in your professional association is extremely important. And they actually have a lot of power. We actually have a lot of power if we organize and come up with, you know, paper orientation for the administrations and those in charge who have to adjust the salaries. That was one part of your question that I wanted to answer.
Yeah. Shall I just take the other part, which is the bit about people accepting lower paid work in order to get a foot in the door. And Vanessa, I think you mentioned both low salaries and volunteering. And the issue with that is the lack of diversity that it creates in our profession. And there is a real issue about lack of diversity, I think in all countries, that particularly because of low salaries, that tends to people who do not have the means to support themselves through training and through periods of low salary can't enter the profession. I think it's really regrettable that I think throughout the world our profession is undiverse. And we have thought at IIC about if there's anything that we can do to help with this. And the issue particularly about the salaries, is that there is just an extraordinary difference between salaries for conservators in different nations. I was Amber and I were talking to Rachel Sabino from the Art Institute of Chicago, and Rachel, I think, was saying that an entry-level salary there is something like $72,000.
Oh, in Washington, D.C.
Oh, in Washington, 72,000. I mean, we would dream of a salary like that, even for quite a senior conservators. So there is not just the disparity between different professions, but a huge disparity between nations. And I think, from also what Johanna said, conservators are in a very good position in the States, and I think we could learn a lot from how the profession has developed there.
Excuse me.
Okay, question at the back. There's a question from.
Okay. I just wanted to comment on Gunnar Heidenreich's point with regards to learning priorities, and this is also a very important topic. Sorry to relate to the earlier one. I think if there is one for my German colleagues or for the people who are non-native English speakers, I think one priority I would name is learning English. In the very, very early days of your career, that's the best opportunity to do it, and it's much more difficult at a later stage of your career. And everything like the documentations, a lot of the literature, lots of the discussions, even the discussion here is held in English. So if you encourage yourself to learn English very early at your stage in your professional career, that is probably worthwhile. At least from my own experience, I would mention that as an important point.
Hi, my name is Amber Kerr. I'm Chief of Conservation at the London Conservation Centre, Smithsonian. And I just wanted to add that the reason why that salary structure is there, it actually is based on a government scale of pay, and we had to work really hard to get the conservators recognized with the scientific background and skill sets to put them in a category, a GS scale level, basically in government pay, that was appropriate for their training and the education they came from. And that was not an easy thing. But basically, the entry-level position in a government, in the Smithsonian, is what we call a GS-11. So it's a government scale level. But that entry level is above the market. It's above when I was seeing where the surveys were showing what the private conservators were being paid in private companies or even in other museums. I realized how fortunate my employees were to be federal employees and to be compensated appropriately, I feel, for the skill sets that they brought to the table. But we had to work really hard in lobbying, and again, it goes back to that advocacy and the idea that if you want better wages, you have to be active, you have to be, helping to push the understanding of our field and to help it get recognized for the level of training that it has and the commitment of the people who are in it.
I wanted also to add a point to that, with this kind of feeding into raising the awareness of the profession internally as and externally. And how do you think is the role of research into that? So how is the active research in the institution or between institutions? What's the role of creating awareness? Sometimes the feedback and the recognition has first to come from outside before it happens inside. To build your profile in the institution, not passively expecting that recognition, but more actively working on it also.
I think that research and publications greatly enhance members of staff in the eyes of senior management and collaboration with other organisations, both within your country and internationally. The EU has been fantastic from the point of view of funding research projects and fostering, international connections. Actually, just as you said that, Esther, I suddenly thought of that point about how bringing in experts from outside is also very effective. So if you've made those contacts through a research collaboration, and then you invite one of the senior researchers from outside to come in, and they say exactly what you would have said, but because they're from outside, it very often has more weight. And so this is another top tip I give you for today.
Yeah, for us, research has been a really important tool as well, for two reasons. I think first, it's a fantastic platform to nurture a common field of engagement between curators, conservators, conservation scientists, outside of your regular day-to-day museum practice. And to come together to meet each other in different ways, to brainstorm together, to conceive of ideas together, to discuss things from different angles. That is one, and that is creating relationships that are really valuable and feedback into the day-to-day. And then the second is that a well-structured project that is convincing and significant, not just for your little institution, but to the community, to the wider field, brings in money. And that money can generate new potentials, and it also creates respect for your activities. Money is a form of acknowledgement by other entities that what you do is significant work, is meaningful work. And I already said before, forging those alliances with an external reference system, with the observer from the outside, can be extremely valuable to be recognized better.
Yes, I fully agree to Johanna and Sarah. In my opinion, research is really an important thing in a museum, and I think about our two projects concerning the Impressionists together with the CICS, and many students were involved in this research as well. And the second one with the Dörner Institute and the Staatsgemäldesammlung in Munich. They both enhanced our authority, our acceptance in the museum.
Can I just, has this been a question from our online
there? Sorry. The question is what you think, what we as students can do to participate in this, I would say, struggle to raise the salaries, to get this money, and what we can directly do as not already working professionals, but still students.
Not sure that was clear to me. What can we students do to
participate in this the struggle to get more money for the conservation departments or for the salaries, or to take part in this?
Try to do interdisciplinary work. Find an art history student and come up with a research project together. Write papers together, present at student conferences together, or not student conferences, other conferences together. Find your allies now. Meet each other and learn from each other. Speak each other's language. Create a common language. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to follow up. It's not working, right?
They're all giving up on us. Is time running out?
Do you want this one?
The panel will be
I just wanted to make a comment about the importance of research. It was actually, I'd say that was the most important factor that led to the change in salaries in the Rijksmuseum. So because the Dutch scientific organization has been very active in the last number of years in supporting conservation-related research activities. And when I started in the Rijksmuseum in 2014, I think we were very successful in getting funding for research projects. And in a way, we must have almost embarrassed the directors into pushing this initiative together with our human resources department in promoting this idea of bringing the conservators up to the same level as the curators. Because year after year, we're bringing money to the museum. Exactly. And I think I totally support what you just said about what can young conservators do: write papers, publish, develop your contacts, talk to curators, talk to scientists. That's how it all happens. So you have to take action.
Can I just say something to that? Because I was a little bit part of the Dutch process going on. It doesn't happen overnight. I think it started maybe 3 decades ago, maybe a little bit longer. There's already a very healthy, or because of these flat cultures, very healthy exchange and a very positive, and everyone with the same impact and the same position. But it started 30 years ago, and now we're seeing effectively the dialogue kind of and the consequences happening by the leveling all the positions last year. So it doesn't happen overnight, but it is, it is. There's way forwards, and I think communication and the joint work and the joint research will have definitely a good outcome.
Is it working? Yes. Hi, thank you very much for these wonderful contributions. I'm Melissa, and I started working at Documenta half a year ago, and I find myself in a long existing hierarchy without an established permanent conservation department. And with the upcoming Documenta Institute, the awareness for the need of an own conservation department rose. And they have a beautiful media and performance-based object collection. I think I wanted to ask if you could share some advice or experiences with building up a conservation department and positioning that, in a hierarchy with a lot of different players.
I just looked at the clock. I think I'll give you my card, okay? Because this is too much for this panel, I think. All the same things that we already talked about, lobbying, and it's not going up the stairs, it's kind of spiraling up and doing everything at the same time, and keep your direction in mind. You have to build bridges and find allies and convince. Sorry to disappoint you.
As an introduction to that, I can refer to your Institute of Fine Arts talk. I think that's still online to be found when exactly on that process. That is a fantastic resource. It's really quite fun and informative too.
Hello, I'm Emily. I'm from the University of Melbourne as well. My question was I feel like the discussion has been a bit conservators versus curators, and I think it's what we see a lot, but it's very short-sighted. So I'm quite interested in how much time you actually spend talking to executive teams and governments and local governments who have zero museum or collection understanding or knowledge. And do you think there are ways that we can start doing that more efficiently and more effectively, so that this then I guess plays into the next panel about general public, but people who are decision makers who don't understand what we do at all, how much time and energy do you have to spend advocating to them?
I mean, that's extremely important for any government or local authority, local government funded organisation. I mean, I must say I don't have personal experience of that because, working for an independent charity, we were never dependent on public funding. And I have to say, I have been extremely, happy to not have to do that advocacy, because not only are you independent of the decision-making bit of it, but you can also fundraise. It's very difficult to fundraise for any sort of publicly funded organisation. But my observation of, I mean, now as a trustee, for example, of the Science Museum Group in London, Ian Blatchford, who is director of the Science Museum, he's also chair of the National Museum Directors Conference. So there are 24 nationally funded museums in the UK, and their funding comes from something called the Comprehensive Spending Review, which is how the British government decides how to prioritise its spending. And the national museums are really good at that advocacy. They do it through the National Museum Directors Conference Council. And I would say that it's probably, you know, a one-day-a-week activity for the director of the museum. I mean, I think that you can probably assume that that sort of advocacy is going to happen from director, executive team level, supported by their, you know, external affairs or strategy and external affairs departments. But, you know, you absolutely cannot underestimate that. I think as a member of staff, there's also that job to do advocacy to the executive team. I mean, I'm not so much talking about the needs to bring funding in for the museum overall, but the needs to bring funding to the department. And, you know, having the head of department, and so this point about, you know, having a head of conservation as well as a head curator and a head of external, head of visitor experience, etc., who has a seat in the executive team is really, it's really helpful and really important.
Maybe just a very short comment about that. At the Guggenheim, all of the department heads, so the chief of conservation, the chief of curatorial, and so forth, they all were also the deputy directors. So there was a team of 7 or 8 deputy directors that built the cabinet around the director of the Guggenheim, which created another, you know, equal platform for all of these, and highlights the horizontal structure that was there. And in my current job, of course, I'm no longer reporting to a museum director. We're an independent institute, and my boss is basically the communal cultural administration. And of course, every funded project that we would like to receive taxpayer money for has to go through the politics. So we're preparing official applications that have to be defended, that have to be presented to the boards, the various boards, the city board, etc., that then decide whether our projects are worthy of funding. So yes, I do have to talk to people completely outside of conservation and outside of culture all the time.
Hello. Yes. Hi. Hi. That's my name is Hilary. I'm from Fleming College in Canada, and my question is very linked to your question about the advocacy of our role and our profession to the money makers, the donors, the boards of directors. We've had a lot of discussions in my course about the role and the value of the white lab coat as a way to look professional, to argue for our scientific background. And we've kind of been advised for, let's say you have a board meeting about funding or about wanting to be involved in acquisitions, to instead of have it in the boardroom with the cakes and the coffee, to bring it to the lab, to put your lab coat on, to get your gloves on, and to kind of have that scenario set up as a way to suggest our expertise and our value. And I'm curious if that's discussed in Europe, if that's kind of common knowledge and uninteresting, if there's any kind of, there's always the apron lab coat debate of like which side you're on, and I don't know, just like whether that's a useful tool in the advocacy of our profession.
I don't want to go in costume. If I have a board panel, I want to sit at the table just like everyone else. And there's a place for aprons when I'm doing dirty work with paints or whatever. But there's no reason to wear it when I sit in a board meeting or in some other kind of meeting. That's my personal opinion. Sorry, I meant the white lab coat. It's if it's not worn for its purpose to protect the object from my fibers or me from the dirt of my work, then I think it's a costume, and I don't see any reason for wearing it outside of those applications.
I mean, chemists and natural scientists also use lab coats for the same purpose of work safety, and we do not take it out of the lab. And our discussions done eye to eye level are done not with a lab coat on. So I think you have to have your authority, your presence, and the awareness of your profession with another strategy, maybe. Yeah, but perhaps bringing sometimes a discussion to the object when it's in the atelier, that could change the scenario a little bit. But I don't think you have to change the dress you can. Yeah.
Think of a medical staff sitting in a decision-maker meeting. They are not wearing their surgical gear or so either. I think it projects an image as if you were trying to use it as a means of impressing or getting the right context, when no, the responsibility is solely on you. You have to believe in what you have to say, you have to claim the authority, and you have to convince people. And whatever support gear you need, it's just peripheral stuff. You can go there in your brightest dress and have all the authority that you need.
Thank you.
I'm not missing. It seems to be an extra turn for this, but raise your hand more convincingly if I'm missing this side of the other table. Of this moment. Yeah.
Okay. I really like when you talked about other skills, and I'm really interested in management and collections management. For example, there is a course in Lisbon that I would like to take in heritage management. But my question is, where would I fit then? Because we know the conservator is many things, but often people think and see us as only craftspeople. And there are like the conservators and managers, and I would be maybe in between, and none of each would hire me. So is that false or?
Sarah is both.
Yeah, and I honestly, if I could tell you something, I don't even know if I can admit it, particularly not as it's being recorded. But I studied at the Courtauld easel painting conservation, not because I wanted to be a conservator, but because I wanted to understand about paintings and why they deteriorated and how they could be managed, how collections of paintings could be managed in a way that slowed down their rate of deterioration. So, when in the first week I was put down in front of a painting and told to spit clean it, I was sort of a bit shocked, really. So it's completely legitimate to train as a conservator and then to be working in the field. It could be in a collections management position, it could be preventive conservation. There are any number of routes that you can go down. And it's not just the Lisbon course. There's a very good course at University College London at the Institute of Sustainable Heritage, which is very multidisciplinary. And that enables you at a postgraduate, that's a master's course, so postgraduate level, to be learning with all of those professionals that you are likely to be spending the rest of your working life with. So architects, engineers, historians. It's a fantastic course from that point of view. So you should, there are lots and lots of routes that one can go down. And actually, I think Sarah Stanage, who is the executive director of IIC, who started off as in conservation, as a conservator or doing conservation training, and her career has taken a very different route. So I don't know if Sarah can get the mic at some point and just illustrate all the different directions that you could go in. But I'm happy to talk to you about other courses.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I started off as a conservator and I trained at Lincoln in the UK, and I looked at the specialisms, and I certainly looked at going into other areas as well, and certainly management. So I took on project management initially, but heritage and heritage-led regeneration was something that I picked up on with a lot of museum development work, and conservation was very much embedded in that. And that was my first step, actually, into quite large regeneration projects. And since then, it's been sort of a management and leadership route until I was really lucky to be able to do a CLAW leadership programme. And that, I think leadership has been mentioned a couple of times. I would wholeheartedly recommend doing that at different points in your career. And I think as you evolve as an individual, it's those points to self-reflect that become really, really important, and to know yourself as an individual.
So my question is related to what you're talking about the different career paths, because I have been getting involved in science a lot more in the last years after I graduated as a conservator, and in a lot of these positions I see there are more chemists or science related people more than maybe a conservator that then continues a path in material science or these things. So I would like to know your thoughts about it.
That's a very interesting point. I have come across different possible career paths, and I kind of crossed a little bit over. I think I started with the natural sciences, and then wanted to get closer to art, a little bit with the same motivations that Sarah just talked about. I wanted to understand better about the degradation, the process, the conservation of paintings. I don't remember at which point that clicked in my head, but that became so clear at one point that I was looking for programs that did that. And in Lincoln, so we find that we're all connected somehow. So Lincoln Leicester at that point offered a conservation science masters, where they really tried to bring everyone together. So they bring conservators, train them in the chemistry department at Leicester University for 6 months, poor souls, and then would take chemists or physicists and train them for 6 months at the conservation department in Lincoln, and then we would have 1 year together where we'd do research. Of course, the path is much harder for conservators trying to get all the principles of science in 6 months. with the intention of being conservation sciences at the end, and for the scientists it was easier to get the principles, the materials, the ethics of conservation to then just get into the world and not become a conservator, but to get familiar with that language and those materials. So I think our path was a little bit easier. So that's coming to say that if you come from the science, it's perhaps a little bit easier, because it doesn't start, the preparation for the sciences also doesn't just as you go into the university, there's the path before that. And if you have missed that vocation, or if you do not have that drive already through high school and in preparation, then maybe it's a little bit harder to get into the sciences. I have seen several programs where that is possible, but it's normally easier, and that justifies maybe what you have been saying, if you go through the sciences into conservation or into conservation-related topics. And that's maybe why you see more that path than the other way around, and having conservators then deciding for hard sciences. Although we have some students that now are hesitating, if not going deeper into the chemistry, I think, by doing bachelors. But so this. Does that kind of explain why you observe what you have?
It was more like, I could start another bachelor, but this is difficult, like another 4 years, and I already have a bachelor and a master. So it's like what path to follow to get more involved in conservation science, being a conservator.
No, I think you can do that in collaborative terms. I mean, and I think either doing that type of training that I was talking about, that conservators that have then 1 year as 1.5 years research master, where you already have some affinity and some interest in the sciences, maybe you are the right candidate for that type of program, to kind of get into the sciences and to the applied sciences, and it will be an applied science type of career, so that's for conservation science afterwards. So I think you have that profile, and those programs, the Leicester Lincoln program doesn't exist anymore. I don't know, Sarah, if there is an alternative now, but there are other types of programs that do that. So take conservation and try to keep you, get you into applied conservation science fields. I think in Italy there's some programs that you can do that without having to study the basic sciences again, so do another bachelor. I mean, so more at master and at specialization level. That's maybe what I would do. And if you have the affinity for that, you'll be okay.
But Esther, the other thing we haven't talked much about are PhDs, and they're certainly in the UK. There are funded PhDs in heritage science. So they're always called collaborative PhDs, because the collaboration is between a university and a museum or heritage organisation. So, for example, English Heritage are currently hosting a collaborative PhD student who's looking at pest management. And there has been some really good funding for that in the UK, and that's been open to people from all nations. It's not just for Brits. So I mean, I don't know. I really don't know what I think about PhDs, unless you are going to go and work in a university, because I imagine all of you who are teaching here have PhDs. So that's another possible route after you've done your masters.
Yeah, that's true. I think a third cycle study and a PhD, you will have much more possibility and to actually go into a scientific and natural sciences approach into a conservation-related topic. So do an applied research. That's very true. I think PhDs are also a lot of fun, and they are paid, and it's one way of building your experience and your contacts. But I also agree with that debate that you have to think if that's the right step always, because then you might be, again, overqualified for a position. So you have to think what you want to do in the future. But that's one possibility also, yeah. I have now the clear sign from the panel before that we have reached, unfortunately, the end of our time. We will have now lunch together, so unofficially we can continue these discussions. But I would like for you to join me thanking this wonderful panel. It's incredible how fast these 2.5 hours have gone. And thank you again for taking your time, for coming over, and